When you think about it, the legal DNA of a nation like India, with over 1 billion people, where did that come from? Well, the fascinating thing is, its core structure wasn't just created overnight. It was slowly and almost accidentally built over 2 whole centuries of British rule. It's an incredible story. So let's get right into it.
It all kicks off not with a government, but with a trading company, the East India Company. They arrived for business way back in 1608, but by 1765, they were running the show. And from there, a whole series of acts and regulations started flowing out of London, each one another brick in the foundation of what would become the modern Indian state.
So here's how we're going to break this down. We'll start with how these traders became rulers. Then we'll see how the company's power was first managed and later taken over completely by the British Crown. We'll look at the first small steps of including Indians in their own governance, follow the long path to self-government, and finally, we'll get to the moment of independence. For a long time, the East India Company was just that, a company, all about trade. But then came a massive turning point after the Battle of Buxar in 1764. The Mughal emperor gave them something called the Diwani. And believe me, this one grant, it changed absolutely everything. So what made Diwanis such a game changer? Well, it wasn't just about collecting taxes. It gave the company the right to run the civil justice system too. This was the exact moment a business transformed into a government. It marked the start of their career as a major territorial power in India. Now, this kind of power in the hands of a private company, well, it started making people in London very, very nervous. The British government realized they couldn't just let a corporation run huge territories without any oversight. And so began the first major era of regulation, what we call the company rule. To get a handle on the company's growing power, the British Parliament started passing a bunch of laws. Now, the funny thing is, they weren't trying to create a nation. They were just trying to control a company. But in doing so, they ended up writing the very first drafts of India's constitutional blueprint. First up, the Regulating Act of 1773. This was a huge deal. It was the British government's first real attempt to put a central authority in place. They took the Governor of Bengal and promoted him to Governor-General. Lord Warren Hastings was the first one. And they set up a Supreme Court in Calcutta. For the very first time, all these scattered territories were being pulled under one central command. The next big step was Pitt's India Act of 1784. And this one was pretty clever. It created what was called a double government. It was a clear split. The company's directors could keep handling the business side of things, but a new board of control in London would manage all the political, civil, and military stuff. The bottom line, the British government now had the final say over everything. Then the Charter Act of 1833 took this idea of central control to a whole new level. The Governor-General of Bengal was now the Governor-General of all of India, with Lord William Bentinck taking the role. All legislative power was in his hands. And this marks the final shift. The East India Company was no longer a trading business at all. It was now, for all practical purposes, a purely administrative machine for the British state. The last Charter Act, from 1853, is where you can literally see the seeds of modern India being planted. It did some amazing things. For the first time, it separated the lawmaking and executive functions, creating a kind of mini parliament. It brought in open competition for civil service jobs, which meant Indians could now join the administration. And it even introduced local representation. The DNA of a modern government is right there. And then 1857 happened, the Great Sepoy Mutiny. It was a massive earthquake that shook the foundations of British rule. After that, the government in London decided the game was up. The idea of a company running India was over. It was time for the British Crown to take direct, absolute control. The response, the Government of India Act of 1858, was swift and it was final. This wasn't about regulating the company anymore. It was about getting rid of it entirely. The era of direct rule from London had officially begun. So, what did this act do? Well, it completely changed the system. The company was gone, the title of Governor-General was upgraded to Viceroy, the Crown's personal representative, Lord Canning was the first, and a new, powerful post was created back in London, the Secretary of State for India. Now, after the shock of the 1857 revolt, the British had a major realization. They couldn't govern India alone. They needed cooperation from Indians. This led to a series of Indian Councils Acts, which were the very first, very cautious steps toward including Indians in the lawmaking process. You can see it happening in slow motion, really. The 1861 Act allowed a few Indians to be nominated to the councils. Then, the 1892 Act increased those numbers and gave them the power to, actually discuss the budget. But it was the 1909 Act that really shook things up. 60. Just think about that number. Under the morally mental reforms of 1909, the Central Legislative Council jumped from just 16 members all the way to 60. It was a huge expansion. But, and this is a huge but, it came with a very controversial twist. The act introduced this idea of separate electorates. Basically, it meant that Muslim members would be elected only by Muslim voters. This move, which some called legalizing communalism, was an incredibly important step that would have massive consequences for the political future of the entire subcontinent. By the early 1900s, the conversation had shifted. It wasn't just about having a seat at the table anymore. The demand was for responsible government, a system where the people in power are actually answerable to the elected representatives. The next phase of reforms was all about trying to meet this growing demand. The Government of India Act of 1919 brought in this really complicated system called diarchy. You can think of it as giving with one hand but holding back with the other. So some subjects, like education and health, were transferred to Indian ministers. But the real power centers, things like finance and the police, were kept as reserved subjects, still under the British governor's control. It was a half step, but a step nonetheless. And that brings us to the big one, the Government of India Act of 1935. Honestly, this was the mother of all pre-independence acts. It was a huge, detailed document. It gave the provinces a lot more freedom, what they called provincial autonomy, and it laid out a plan for an all-India federation. Its structure was so comprehensive that it literally became the skeleton for the Constitution of independent India. Finally, after 2 world wars, a powerful freedom movement, and this long, winding legislative journey, the end was in sight. The British Parliament passed one last act, not to govern India, but to set it free. The Indian Independence Act of 1947 was simple and direct. It ended British rule, period. It provided for the partition into India and Pakistan. It got rid of the viceroy, and, most importantly, it gave the brand new constituent assemblies of both countries the full power to draft their own constitutions and to keep or throw out any British law they wanted. And there it is, the culmination of everything we've just talked about. The first cabinet of a free India, formed in 1947. That 200-year-old blueprint, which was pieced together through acts of trade, control, and regulation, was finally handed over. It was now in the hands of the Indian people, to be reshaped into a constitution for a new nation. The legacy of this journey is just immense. The structure of India's civil services, the way its parliament works, even the very concept of a strong central government, you can trace all of it back to this 200-year evolution. And that leaves us with one final thought. How do these deep historical echoes continue to shape the challenges and the successes of modern India today?